The snow fell soft and slow over the Allegheny foothills, the kind of snow that does not announce itself, the kind that simply arrives and keeps arriving until everything that was sharp becomes soft, and everything that was loud becomes quiet, and the world reduces itself to white air and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere through the trees. Adelaide Whitmore stood in that snow at the edge of an abandoned railbed in central Pennsylvania, 20 years old, and she carried everything she owned in a canvas duffel bag slung across her right shoulder. Her left hand was shoved deep into the pocket of a peacoat that had belonged to her father once a long time ago, and her right hand held the strap of the duffel, as though letting go of it might mean falling through the snow into something even colder. In the inside pocket of that peacoat, folded 3 times to fit, lay a $10 bill. The total sum of everything she had in the world that could be exchanged for food or warmth or shelter, $10. The price of a cheap diner breakfast and a tip. The price of half a tank of goose in a car she did not own. The price, as it would turn out, of an entire railroad depot built in 1889 and abandoned in 1960 and forgotten by almost everyone who had ever known it existed. Against her collarbone, beneath 2 layers of shirt and the heavy wool of the coat, a railroad chronometer ticked on a leather cord. It was the kind of timepiece that had once regulated an entire division of the Pennsylvania Railroad, kept accurate to within 3 seconds per month by men who believed that knowing the exact time was a moral obligation to the strangers depending on them. Her grandfather Ezra had carried it for 32 years. Her father Theodore had carried it after that. Now it hung against her skin, ticking, ticking, the only sound in the world that belonged entirely to her. Adelaide breathed out, and her breath made a small, white cloud that hung in the air for a moment and then dissolved. She looked at the depot across the clearing. It was a single-story structure, board and batten siding faded from what had once been Pennsylvania Railroad red to the color of dried clay. The peaked roof showed missing shingles even from 50 feet away. The wide overhanging eaves still held their dignity, the way old men sometimes hold their dignity even when their bodies have begun to fail them. A bay window projected toward where the tracks had once been, where now there was only a slight depression in the ground, filled with ballast stones and weeds. A tall brick chimney rose from the back wall, and even from this distance she could see the crack running down its length like a long, dark scar. Above the bay window, on a green board, weathered nearly to gray painted red letters, spelled out 3 words and a railroad's name: Hartwell Junction, Penn RR. 72 hours earlier, Adelaide had been sleeping on a bench in the Harrisburg bus station using her duffel bag as a pillow, waking every hour when security made their rounds and asked to see her ticket. She had no ticket. She'd been buying coffee at the lunch counter every couple of hours just to have a receipt that looked like she might still be a passenger and not what she actually was, which was a homeless girl with no destination and no plan. 72 hours from now, she would either freeze to death in this building or she would make it her home. There was no middle ground. There was no third option. There was no safety net stretched beneath this particular high-wire act, and she knew it the way a person knows the weight of their own bones. She picked up the duffel and started walking toward the depot. Her boots crunched through 3 inches of fresh snow, over a layer of older snow that had partially crusted over and then softened again. The platform came up to meet her, weathered boards green with moss and lichen, several planks visibly rotted through. She tested each one before putting her full weight on it. Some of them held. Some of them flexed downward in a way that promised collapse. Behind her closed eyes for a moment, she could see her mother standing in the kitchen of the row house in Harrisburg, the kitchen where Adelaide had eaten cereal 1,000 mornings before school. She could see her mother's hands holding a coffee cup. She could see the new locks on the door. She could see the cardboard box on the porch and the chronometer placed carelessly on top of it, almost mockingly, the way a person sets down something they are pretending not to value. Vivian. That was her mother's name. Vivian Whitmore, who had become Vivian Harper 4 years after Theodore Whitmore died under a railroad bridge near Johnstown, when a rusted bolt that should have been replaced finally let go. Adelaide opened her eyes and pushed the kitchen and the box and the chronometer on top of it back down into the place where she kept the things she could not afford to look at directly. Then she walked the rest of the way across the platform to the waiting room door. The door hung slightly askew on its hinges. The brass knob was cold enough through her glove to feel like ice. She turned it and it turned, and the door swung inward into a darkness that smelled like 66 years of abandonment. Cold ash, old paper, mineral dust, the particular staleness that comes from air that has been still for so long it has forgotten what it means to move. She stepped inside and let her eyes adjust. The waiting room stretched perhaps 30 feet long and 15 wide. The slate floor was scuffed soft by generations of travelers. Dark, wainscoted walls climbed to a height of about 4 feet, water-stained in places where the roof had leaked. A long wooden bench ran along the wall, and even in the dim light, she could see the carved initials of people who had waited here for trains that would carry them to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, or places that no longer existed in the form they had existed when those people had been waiting. In the corner stood the black pot-bellied stove, cold its flue pipe disappearing into the ceiling. At the far end of the room, beneath where the bay window projected outside a closed wooden door, was set into the wall. The ticket office. The room where the station agent had once sat watching the tracks, taking the orders, signing the waybills, making the decisions that had moved freight across state lines and carried passengers across rivers. Adelaide walked the length of the waiting room slowly, her footsteps loud in the silence. She put her gloved hand on the cold iron of the pot-bellied stove. She put her hand on the wooden bench fingers, finding the grooves of initials carved by people whose names she would never know. She walked to the ticket office door and turned the brass knob. The door swung open into a space perhaps 6 feet square. A high wooden desk faced the bay window, positioned so the agent could watch the tracks without rising from his stool. A row of pigeonholes was built into the wall above the desk, the little rectangular boxes where waybills and receipts and the endless paperwork of a functioning railroad had once been filed. A small iron safe sat on the floor in the corner, its door hanging open empty for 66 years. A chalkboard mounted to the back wall still showed the last entry ever written there, ghosted in faint white chalk, 7:15 a.m. westbound late. Adelaide sat on the wooden stool. The chronometer ticked against her collarbone. Outside the bay window, the snow fell harder, accumulating on the empty railbed, covering the ballast stones, covering the weeds, covering everything. She thought about her grandfather Ezra, 32 years maintaining signal equipment for the Pennsylvania Railroad, climbing signal towers in weather exactly like this, checking connections and clearing ice from crossing gates, making sure the lights that told engineers when to stop and when to proceed worked with absolute reliability. Because the alternative to reliability, as he had taught her when she was small enough to sit on his lap, was death. She thought about her father, Theodore. 12 years inspecting railroad bridges for the regional carrier, filing report after report about a bridge near Johnstown that needed immediate attention. Reports that had been ignored because of budget constraints. He had been underneath that bridge when a rusted-through bolt had finally given way and brought part of the structure down on him. Adelaide had been 7 years old. She thought about the chronometer her grandfather had carried for 3 decades. The chronometer that had been sitting on his workshop bench stopped at exactly 7:23 p.m. when his heart had stopped beating 14 months after his son's funeral. She thought about the cardboard box on her mother's porch and the new locks and the long walk through March cold to Hattie Donovan's diner carrying everything she owned. Hattie had given her a room above the diner without asking questions. 2 months. Then the radio and the voice of a journalist named Margot Sinclair interviewing the supervisor of Pine Ridge Township about a surplus building program for properties scheduled for demolition. A schoolhouse, a Grange Hall, a creamery, and near the end of the list, described with the bureaucratic flatness of paperwork, a former Pennsylvania Railroad depot at Hartwell Junction. Abandoned 1960, available for $10. Adelaide had stopped washing dishes mid-plate sudsy water dripping from her hands onto the rubber mat, and the world had contracted to a single point of focus. A train depot for $10. She had exactly $10. Now she sat on the agent's stool, the duffel bag at her feet, and tried to make herself feel something other than the cold. The chronometer ticked. The snow fell. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the practical voice that sounded like her mother told her she was making the worst decision of her life. She did not listen to that voice. She had stopped listening to that voice the moment her mother had changed the locks. 3 hours earlier, she had been sitting on the other side of a metal desk in a 4-room municipal building that also housed the volunteer fire department's administrative office, the Historical Society's filing cabinets, and a cramped meeting room with 8 folding chairs. The Pine Ridge Township Municipal Building. She had walked into it carrying her duffel and her $10 bill, and she had asked for the township clerk. Beatrice Holloway, 57 years old, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, a cardigan sweater buttoned over a flannel shirt despite the heat coming up from the floor vents. She had looked at Adelaide with the particular skepticism that older women reserve for younger women, making obviously poor decisions, and she had said quietly and without inflection the words that should have ended the whole thing right there. You understand the building has no heat, no running water, no roof over the freight room, and the chimney is cracked top to bottom. It's scheduled for demolition in March if nobody takes it. And by takes it, I mean takes it and actually does something, because this office is not interested in selling a property to someone who's going to camp in it for 2 weeks and then disappear and leave us with the same problem we had before. Adelaide had placed the $10 bill on the desk between them. She had folded it very carefully so the corners lined up. She had smoothed it flat with the side of her hand. Yes, ma'am, I understand. Beatrice had studied her for a long moment. Something in Adelaide's posture, spine straight, shoulders back, chin level, had shifted something in the older woman's expression. The way Adelaide held herself had not been taught at a finishing school. It had been taught by a man in a workshop, a man with grease under his fingernails, a man who had told a small girl that how you stand tells people whether they can push you around. Beatrice had pulled a D-book from the shelf behind her, the kind of oversized leather-bound volume that predated computers by generations. She had turned to a page that appeared to have been waiting for exactly this moment. Sign here, here, and here. Adelaide had signed Adelaide Marie Whitmore in the careful, slanted script her grandfather had taught her when she was 7 years old, when he had explained to her that a signature was a promise written in ink, and a person who signed carelessly was a person who made promises carelessly. Beatrice had taken the $10 bill, folded it once with precise movements, tucked it into a metal cash box that might itself have been older than the depot, and stamped the deed with a brass stamp that made a soft percussive sound, like a door closing very far away. It's yours. Adelaide had stood up, taken the deed, and asked for directions. Beatrice had given them. 1.25 miles down the old access road, then another 1/4 mile along the rail bed itself. Her husband had a truck out front if Adelaide wanted a ride. But Adelaide had wanted to walk. She had needed to walk. She had needed to feel each step covering the distance between the life she had been pushed out of and the life she was now walking into, and she had needed the chronometer to measure that distance against her collarbone, second by second, the way her grandfather would have measured anything that mattered. Before she left, Beatrice had said one more thing. The older woman's voice had dropped slightly. The skepticism had not disappeared, but something else had moved in underneath it. Watch out for a man named Garrett Devlin. He's been waiting on this property for 3 years. He thought he was going to get it for nothing once we pulled the demolition. He is not going to be happy that someone got there first with $10. Adelaide had nodded. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Now sitting in the ticket office with her duffel at her feet, Adelaide thought about that warning. She did not yet have a face to put with the name Garrett Devlin. She did not yet know what kind of man waited 3 years for a piece of land. She did not yet know what such a man might do when he discovered that a 20-year-old girl with a $10 bill had walked into the township office and walked out with the deed. She slid off the stool and knelt to examine the floor beneath it. The floorboards in the ticket office were old pine-worn, smoothed by decades of an agent's feet. She ran her fingers along the seams, feeling for anything irregular, and found nothing. She examined the walls, the pigeonholes, the safe, the desk itself. Nothing obvious, no loose panels, no secret compartments of the kind that existed in stories, but rarely in actual buildings. Then she stood and looked at the chimney. The brick chimney ran up through the corner of the ticket office, providing the structural support for the flue that connected to the pot-bellied stove in the waiting room. The bricks were old, hand-fired clay from an era before standardized manufacturing. They showed the irregularities of 19th century masonry work, every brick a little different from every other. But one section about chest height showed bricks that were slightly different. Not different in the way that hand-fired bricks are all a little different from each other. Different in a way that suggested intention. The mortar was a fractionally different shade of gray. The spacing between the courses was just marginally tighter than the surrounding work. 3 bricks, maybe 4. Adelaide went back outside to her duffel and pulled out a flat stone she had picked up from the rail bed on her walk in roughly the size and shape of a putty knife. She had picked it up because she had thought it might be useful. She had not known for what. She came back inside and used the stone to carefully probe the mortar around the different-looking bricks. On the first one, the mortar held. On the second one, it held. On the third brick, she tried the mortar crumbled away under her stone with almost no pressure. Dry, powdery, clearly much newer than the surrounding century-old work, and clearly applied by someone who had not been a professional mason, but who had wanted the seal to look right at first glance. She worked the brick loose. It came out into her hand with a small grating sound, and behind it in the body of the chimney was a cavity. A space had been carved into the chimney's interior, perhaps a foot deep and 10 inches wide. The walls of the cavity had been carefully lined with sheet tin to protect whatever was stored there from moisture. Adelaide's heart began to beat in a way she could feel through the chronometer against her collarbone, the rhythm of her pulse colliding with the rhythm of the watch. Inside the cavity, she could see 4 objects. A small metal cash box, smaller than a shoebox, the kind of fireproof container a shopkeeper might have once kept under a counter. A leather-bound diary, its cover cracked along the spine. A folded rectangle of dark cloth. A small cloth bag that, when she touched it, made a soft metallic sound. She lifted everything out very carefully. Her hands were shaking, and not from the cold. She set the items in a row on the agent's desk, and for a moment, she just stood there, looking at them, feeling the chronometer tick against her collarbone, feeling the silence of the building wrap around her like the snow wrapping around the world outside. The cash box opened with a small key that was taped to its bottom, an act of trust or perhaps resignation. The logic of someone who knew that if the box was found, a lock would not protect its contents, but who could not quite bring himself to leave it entirely unsecured. Inside, in neat stacks, bound with paper bands that crumbled at the edges when she touched them, lay banknotes from the 1940s and 1950s, 20s, 50s, a small stack of $100 bills, the older design, the larger size. She counted them once. Then she counted them again to be sure. $6,840. Beneath the bills, wrapped in wax paper, lay a railroad chronometer, a Waltham 1892 model, the kind issued to station agents and dispatchers, the same general category of timepiece as the one against her collarbone, though a different model and a different year of manufacture. It was in pristine condition. Still wound though it had stopped at 3:47, the hands frozen at that moment for 66 years. The cloth bag contained 9 silver half-dollars, each one wrapped in tissue paper that had yellowed to the color of old bone. Coins from an era when silver content meant the metal itself held value beyond the denomination stamped on its face. The folded rectangle of cloth turned out to be a railroad inspector's badge, wrapped in what had once been a handkerchief. Pennsylvania Railroad issue. The name engraved on its face read Bennett Pierce, the year 1956, the badge that an inspector would have been required to turn in upon leaving the railroad's employ, which meant Bennett Pierce had either quit without following procedure or had left under circumstances that made returning the badge impossible or irrelevant. Adelaide picked up the diary last. The leather cover was cracked along the spine. The binding was loose but intact. She opened it to the first page and found in handwriting that was firm and disciplined and very slightly old-fashioned a name and a date. Hollis Pierce, station agent, Hartwell Junction, Pennsylvania Railroad, beginning January 1934. She turned the pages slowly. The early entries were routine, the daily log of a small station's operations. Arrival times and departure times, passenger counts, freight tonnage, weather conditions, notes about track maintenance and signal repairs. A man recording the small repetitive work of keeping a station running. But as the years passed, the entries became less frequent and more personal. And as she turned into 1957 and 1958, the writing took on a different quality. A man not just recording events, but trying to make sense of them. She paused at an entry dated September 14, 1958, because the handwriting had changed in a way she could feel before she could articulate. The letters were pressed harder into the paper. The lines were closer together. The man writing this entry had been angry. She read it slowly. September 14, 1958. 2 men came to the station today, sent by a third man named Harlan Devlin. Harlan Devlin owns a quarry over in Bedford County and has been buying up parcels of railroad land along this division for 2 years. The men presented papers showing that the railroad has agreed to sell the Hartwell Junction property and the surrounding 17 acres to the Devlin Quarry Company at a price of $1 per acre. They asked me to sign as a witness to the transfer in the capacity of station agent of record. They informed me that the inspector responsible for certifying the transfer, a man named Owen Morris from the Pittsburgh office, had already been compensated for his cooperation, and that my own cooperation would be remembered by Mr. Devlin in ways I would find advantageous. Adelaide stopped reading. She read the paragraph again. Then she kept going. I told them I would not sign. I told them that the railroad had not, to my knowledge, agreed to any such transfer, and that the documents they were presenting did not bear the seal of the regional office in Philadelphia, only a stamp that anyone with $12 could have made at a print shop. I told them to leave the station. I told them that if they returned, I would file a report with the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission and with the railroad's own internal investigators. The men did not return, but 3 weeks later I received a notice from the regional office that my position at Hartwell Junction was being reviewed in light of certain operational concerns. I traveled to Philadelphia and sat in front of 3 men in suits and explained what had happened in September. They listened, they took notes, they told me they would investigate. Whether they did, I do not know. The notice was withdrawn 2 months later. Owen Morris was transferred to a different division. Harlan Devlin sent a letter to my home address that contained no signature and no return address, and inside the letter was a single sheet of paper on which someone had typed the words, "You will regret this, Mr. Pierce. Eventually you will regret this very much." I have kept that letter. I have not regretted it. But I have understood that men like Harlan Devlin do not forget. And I have understood that whatever happens to me, the Devlin family will remember the name Pierce and will remember the building called Hartwell Junction. And someday, if they get the chance, they will come back for both. Adelaide closed the diary slowly. The chronometer against her collarbone ticked. The snow fell outside the bay window, soft and patient, indifferent to whatever was happening inside the small building it was burying. She thought about Beatrice Holloway's warning in the township office. Watch out for a man named Garrett Devlin. He's been waiting on this property for 3 years. 3 years was not a long time in the life of a building that had been waiting for 66. But 3 years was a long time for a man to want something he could not have. And Garrett Devlin, whoever he was, came from the Devlin family. The family that had tried to take this land for $1 an acre in 1958. The family that had threatened a station agent for refusing to sign a forged transfer. The family that, according to the man who had hidden this diary in the chimney and then died without seeing his son again, did not forget. Adelaide carefully placed the diary on the desk. She placed the chronometer beside it, and the badge beside that, and the cloth bag of silver coins in the cash box. She arranged them in a row the way her grandfather had taught her to lay out his tools before a job, every item in its place, every item ready to be picked up the moment it was needed. Then she stood in the small ticket office and breathed. A noise came from outside, the crunch of tires on snow. Adelaide moved to the bay window and looked out through the cracked glass. A vehicle was coming down the access road toward the depot. A pickup truck, newer model, black. The kind of truck a man drove when he wanted other men to know he could afford it. The truck pulled up and parked at the edge of the platform. The engine cut off, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was perhaps 55 years old. He wore a wool overcoat over a dark suit. His hair was steel gray, cut short, and his face had the particular blankness of a man who had decided long ago that showing emotion was a weakness. He did not look at the depot. He looked at the platform. Then he looked toward the bay window, and Adelaide knew that even though the glass was cracked and the light was fading, he could see her standing there. He raised his hand and waved the small, precise wave of a salesman. Then he walked toward the door. Adelaide picked up the diary and the cash box and slid them quickly back into the chimney cavity. She picked up the loose brick and pressed it back into place. The fit was tight enough to hold without mortar for the moment. Then she walked through the ticket office door into the waiting room, and she stood with her back to the chimney wall, and she waited. The waiting room door opened. The man stepped inside. He looked around the dim space with the slow evaluating gaze of someone pricing a property for purchase. He did not seem cold even though he had just walked through snow. He did not seem hesitant even though he was entering a building he did not own. His eyes settled on Adelaide. Adelaide Whitmore. It was a statement, not a question. She did not answer. He smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. My name is Garrett Devlin. I own a development company in this part of the state. I would like to buy this property from you. It's not for sale. You haven't heard my offer yet. It's still not for sale. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had expected this answer and was prepared for it. He took a single step forward into the waiting room. He stopped. He looked around again, taking in the wainscoting, the bench, the cold, pot-bellied stove, the doorway to the ticket office. $18,000, he said. That's 1,800 times what you paid. That is the most generous offer you will ever receive for this property in your lifetime, Miss Whitmore. I want you to understand that very clearly. Whatever you have in mind for this building, $18,000 in cash today is more than this building will ever earn you. I'm not selling. Why not? Because it's mine. He laughed. It was a small laugh, brief, and there was something underneath it that was not amusement. Miss Whitmore, you are 20 years old. You are, I am told, currently homeless. You have no construction experience, no permits, no insurance, no realistic plan for surviving a Pennsylvania winter in a building with a collapsed roof and a cracked chimney. The township was going to demolish this property in March. You bought it for $10 2 hours ago, and you have already been inside it long enough to understand that what you bought is a problem you cannot solve. I am offering to remove that problem. I am offering you, in fact, the only path out of the situation you are currently in. He paused. He let the silence settle. Then he continued more quietly. You are a smart girl, Miss Whitmore. I can see that. So let me speak to the smart part of you. You take the $18,000. You go to Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or Cleveland. You rent a room. You enroll in a community college. You build a life. In 2 years, you will look back at this moment and you will thank me for being the man who gave you the way out. That is what is being offered here. That is what you would be a fool to refuse. Adelaide thought about Hollis Pierce sitting in the same building in September 1958, being told by two men that his cooperation would be remembered by Mr. Devlin in ways he would find advantageous. She thought about her grandfather Ezra, who had once explained to her when she was small that the most dangerous men in the world were not the ones who threatened you. The most dangerous men in the world were the ones who offered you something for free because nothing was ever free and the price was always paid eventually, and it was always more than you had been willing to pay if anyone had asked you up front. No, Adelaide said. Thank you. The smile left Garrett Devlin's face. It did not happen quickly. It happened the way ice forms on a window, slowly working its way from the edges in. I would like you to reconsider, Miss Whitmore. My answer is no. You will not be the last person to stand on this property and refuse me, but I want you to understand something while you have the opportunity to understand it. You will be the last person who refuses me and walks away with anything at all. He nodded slowly. He looked once more around the waiting room. He looked at the bench. He looked at the stove. He looked at the closed ticket office door behind her. Then he turned and walked back out the way he had come. Adelaide stayed where she was. She listened to his boots cross the platform. She listened to the truck door open and close. She listened to the engine start. She listened to the tires turn on the snow and the truck's engine fade as it drove back up the access road. She did not move for a long time. When she finally moved, it was to walk to the bay window and look out at the empty rail bed. The light was failing. The snow was falling. Garrett Devlin was gone, but the silence he had left behind in the waiting room was a different silence than the silence she had walked into. It was a silence that knew her name now. It was a silence that had been measured and weighed and would be returned to. She went back to the ticket office. She removed the loose brick. She took the diary out of the chimney cavity and the box and the cloth bag and the badge and the second chronometer. She did not put any of them back. She did not trust the chimney anymore. She wrapped the cash box in her grandfather's old peacoat lining and pushed it deep into the bottom of her duffel. She wrapped the diary in a clean shirt and laid it on top. She wound Bennett Pierce's chronometer and set it on the desk beside her grandfather's, and she synchronized the hands carefully, 5:47. Both watches ticked together. Outside, the last gray of evening drained out of the sky and was replaced by the deep blue that comes before full dark. Adelaide lit one of the 3 candles she had packed. She set it on the windowsill of the bay window, where its small flame doubled itself in the cracked glass. Then she sat on the bench in the waiting room and ate a can of cold soup with a metal spoon because she did not yet trust the flue of the pot-bellied stove enough to light a fire in it. She was halfway through the soup when she heard the second vehicle. This one was older, a pickup truck by the sound of it, but not new. The engine had the slightly rough idle of a vehicle that had been driven for 30 years and maintained by someone who knew how to maintain it. The truck pulled up to the platform. The engine cut. Adelaide set down the soup can. She moved quietly to the bay window. A man got out of the truck. He was perhaps 70 years old. He moved the way men move when their bodies have done hard work for 50 years and have learned to conserve energy. He wore a canvas Carhartt jacket and work pants and boots that had been resoled more than once. He stood for a moment beside his truck and looked at the depot. Then he started walking toward the door. Adelaide felt her hand go to the chronometer at her collarbone. She did not know why. The gesture was older than her thinking. A knock came on the waiting room door. Slow, deliberate, the knock of a man who did not want to startle whoever was inside. A voice followed it, gravelly, old, not unkind. "Hello in there, my name is Cornelius Tarleton. People call me Neil. I came up from Bedford. Beatrice Holloway over at the township office told me a young woman bought the depot today, and I'd like to come in and talk to her if that's all right." Adelaide stood very still. She thought about Garrett Devlin's pickup truck. She thought about the diary in her duffel. She thought about a man who had waited 3 years for a piece of land. But the voice on the other side of the door did not sound like a man who had waited 3 years for a piece of land. It sounded like a man who had been driven through snow at the end of a long day to a place he was not sure he wanted to go. She walked to the door and opened it. The man was taller than she had expected. He held a thermos in one hand and his Carhartt cap in the other, removed in deference to her in a way that almost no one removed a cap anymore. His face was weathered the way Pennsylvania farm country weathers a face. His eyes were a faded blue. He was looking at her, but not in the way Garrett Devlin had looked at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a face he is trying to place. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, sir." "Beatrice said your name, Adelaide Whitmore. I wanted to ask, was your father's name Theodore?" She felt the cold go out of her face and come back twice as hard. "Yes." "And your grandfather, was his name Ezra?" The chronometer ticked against her collarbone. "Yes, sir, Ezra Whitmore. He worked 32 years on the Pocono Division. Signal maintainer." Cornelius Tarleton stood in the open doorway with the snow falling behind him, and for a long moment he did not say anything. Then he reached up with the hand that was holding the cap, and he wiped at his eye with the back of his wrist, and he shook his head slowly. Miss Whitmore, he said, in 1976, my workshop in Bedford burned down. I lost my tools. I lost my equipment. I lost everything I had built up over 20 years of working as a stonemason and bricklayer. I had a wife who was sick, and I had two children, and I did not have the money to rebuild the workshop. And I did not know what I was going to do. And one day, 3 weekends in a row, your grandfather drove down from his house outside Altoona in his own truck, and he helped me clear the debris and pour a new slab and frame the walls. 3 weekends. He would not let me pay him. He brought a thermos of coffee every morning, and he worked beside me until the light went, and at the end of the third weekend, I had a workshop again. He paused. He looked at her face. He looked at the chronometer cord that was visible at the collar of her shirt. Miss Whitmore, I have owed your grandfather, Ezra Whitmore, one debt for 50 years that I have never been able to repay. He is dead, and his son is dead, and I had no way to pay him back. And then today, Beatrice called me on the telephone, and she said, Neil, a young woman bought the old depot at Hartwell Junction this afternoon, and she is going to need help because Garrett Devlin is going to come for her, and her name is Whitmore, and her grandfather's name was Ezra. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Miss Whitmore, I am here to pay back what I owe. The silence in the waiting room stretched out. The two chronometers ticked in the ticket office and against her collarbone in perfect synchronization. The candle in the bay window threw its doubled light across the wainscoting. Outside, the snow kept falling, about impatient and indifferent to anything happening anywhere in the world. Adelaide opened the door wider. Mr. Tarleton, she said, please come in. I have a diary I think you should read. Neil Tarleton stepped across the threshold of the Hartwell Junction depot, and somewhere in the Allegheny foothills, the wind shifted, and somewhere south of them, in a black pickup truck, Garrett Devlin was already on the phone with a man whose name Adelaide did not yet know, and somewhere in Philadelphia, an 89-year-old man named Bennett Pierce was sitting in a small apartment, looking at a photograph of his father that he had not been able to look at for 64 years, and the chronometer ticked against Adelaide's collarbone, the way it had ticked against her grandfather's collarbone and against her father's collarbone before it had been hers. A small station is a patient thing, Hollis Pierce had once written in a diary that nobody had read for 66 years. It waits for the train, then it waits for the next train. Then eventually, when there are no more trains, it waits for whoever will come next. Adelaide Whitmore had come, and she was not going to leave. Neil Tarleton sat on the wooden bench in the waiting room, with the leather-bound diary open on his lap and a pair of reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, and he read for almost 40 minutes without saying a single word. Adelaide had lit the second candle and placed it on the bench beside him, so he could see the pages. She had heated water on the camp stove and made him instant coffee in a chipped mug that had come out of her duffel, and he had taken the mug and held it against his palm while he read, the steam curling up between him and the candlelight, his eyes moving slowly across Hollis Pierce's careful handwriting, the way an old man reads anything that matters. When he reached the September 1958 entry, he stopped. He read it once, then he read it a second time. Then he closed the diary very carefully, set it on the bench beside him, and looked up at Adelaide where she was sitting on the stove's iron pedestal with her arms wrapped around her knees. Harlan Devlin, he said, that would be Garrett's grandfather. I figured. I knew Harlan. Not well. He died in the late 1970s. He was the kind of man who made his money by making other men's lives difficult. And he raised a son who was worse than he was, and that son raised Garrett, who was the worst of all of them and the most patient. Harlan would have come at you with hired men. Garrett will come at you with paperwork and inspectors and friends on the township board and a long, slow squeeze that will look like nothing at all from the outside until the day you look up and find that you have lost. Mr. Tarleton, Neil, Neil, has Garrett Devlin done this before? Neil Tarleton looked at her for a long moment over the tops of his reading glasses. Then he set the mug down on the floor beside him very carefully, the way old men set things down when their hands have started to be slightly less reliable than they used to be. Miss Whitmore, he said, in the last 15 years, Garrett Devlin has acquired and demolished 3 buildings in this county that should have been preserved. The Pemberton Schoolhouse, 1871 beautiful piece of work, slate roof, bell tower, took 140 years for that building to look the way it looked. He had it down in 11 days. The Maury Creamery, 1894 brick and timber construction that you cannot replace anywhere in this state for love or money, down in 9 days. And the Calderwood House, which was the home of the man who wrote the original land survey for half of this township in 1868. He bought that one through a shell company, sat on it for 4 years while the roof failed, and then went to the township and said the building was a public hazard and they let him take it down. That one he replaced with a self-storage facility. He paused. He looked toward the bay window where the snow was still falling outside blue-gray, now in the evening dark. He has not lost a fight in this county in 15 years. I want you to understand that very clearly before you decide what you are going to do. I have already decided what I'm going to do. I know you have. I am telling you anyway. Delayed put her hand on the chronometer at her collarbone without thinking. She felt it tick. Neil, the diary says Hollis Pierce stopped them in 1958. One man, by himself, he stopped them. Hollis Pierce had something Garrett Devlin's people did not expect. What? He had a man behind him at the Pittsburgh office named Lawrence Whitaker, who would not be bought. And he had a wife at home named Eleanor, who told him every morning before he went to work that he was going to come home that night with his integrity intact, because she had not married a man who would compromise it. And he had a son named Bennett, who watched his father work every day and who would have done anything in the world for him, even though they argued about everything. Hollis Pierce was alone in this building, but he was not alone in the world. There is a difference. Neil Tarleton stood up slowly. His knees made a small sound. He picked up the mug from the floor. Miss Whitmore, you are not alone in this building either. But I want you to understand who is going to be on the other side of this fight, because you are 20 years old and you have already been through more than most people go through in a lifetime. And I am not going to lie to you about what is coming. Garrett Devlin is going to try to break you, not all at once. Slowly, the way a man breaks a wild horse. He is going to make you afraid and tired and broke, and he is going to wait for you to fold. And then on a day that he will choose carefully, he is going to come back here and offer you 12,000 instead of 18. And he is going to expect you to take it, and he is going to be surprised when you do not. And that surprise is going to make him angry, and angry men make mistakes. He turned to face her. Our job between now and when he makes that mistake is to keep you alive and to keep this building standing and to keep our eyes open. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Then we start tomorrow. 7 a.m. I will be back with a load of lumber and some tools. We are going to get a tarp over the freight room roof before another foot of snow falls into the building. And after that, we are going to start on the chimney, because if we do not get heat in here before December, you will not survive the winter to fight anyone. He walked to the door, paused, and turned back. Miss Whitmore, one more thing. Your grandfather drank his coffee black with a full spoonful of sugar. I do not know if you knew that. He did. Yes, sir, he did. I will bring sugar tomorrow. The door closed behind him. The truck started. The truck drove away. Adelaide sat on the stove pedestal for a long time after the sound of the engine had faded into the night. The two chronometers ticked together in the ticket office. The candle in the bay window guttered slightly and then steadied. The diary lay closed on the bench beside her. She thought about a man named Lawrence Whitaker at the Pittsburgh office in 1958 and a woman named Eleanor in a kitchen somewhere telling her husband that he was going to come home with his integrity intact, and a son named Bennett who would have done anything in the world for his father. She thought about her own father, who had also done a job that had required integrity and who had filed report after report about a bridge that had eventually killed him. The chronometer ticked. The snow fell. The building waited. That night, before she slept, Adelaide did one more thing. She unrolled her sleeping bag on the wooden bench and she put the duffel under her head as a pillow, and she set both chronometers on the floor beside her where she could hear them ticking through the night. Then she got out the small notebook she had bought at a drugstore in Harrisburg 3 days earlier, when she had still been somebody else, somebody who did not own a building and did not know the name Hollis Pierce and did not know what it meant to have an enemy. She opened the notebook to the first blank page. At the top of the page, in the careful slanted script her grandfather had taught her, she wrote 3 words: "What I have." Below those words, she wrote in a list, the deed signed and stamped, $6,840 in old currency, $815 in a checking account in Harrisburg, 9 silver half-dollars, 2 railroad chronometers both keeping time, a diary written by a man named Hollis Pierce, an inspector's badge belonging to his son, a canvas duffel bag and what is in it, a wood stove that may or may not draw, a woman named Beatrice Holloway who knows my name, a man named Cornelius Tarleton who owes my grandfather a debt. She turned the page. At the top of the next page, she wrote 3 more words: what he has. Below those words, she wrote a longer list: a black pickup truck, a wool overcoat, a development company that has knocked down 3 historical buildings in 15 years, a grandfather named Harlan who tried to take this depot in 1958, a father who taught him that the depot was owed to the family, 3 years of waiting, connections at the township board, inspectors he has paid before, lawyers plural, money I cannot count, the certainty that he has won every fight he has ever picked, a patience that has made him dangerous. She read both lists. She closed the notebook. She lay down on the bench and pulled the sleeping bag up to her chin, and she listened to the chronometers tick on the floor beside her, and she listened to the wind moving outside in the trees behind the depot, and she listened to the small sounds of the building settling around her in the cold. She had less than he had. She knew that. She had known it before she had written either list. But she had something he did not have, and she had not put it on the list because she had not wanted to look at it directly, and she put it down in her mind now, for she fell asleep the way her grandfather had taught her, to put down the most important tool of any job before she finally lay down at the end of the day. She had nothing left to lose. He had everything. In every fight ever fought, the person with nothing left to lose has had an advantage that the person with everything has never quite been able to understand until the moment far too late when he has finally lost. The chronometers ticked. Adelaide slept. Spring came slowly to the Allegheny foothills that year. The snow held into late March, and even when it finally went, it left behind ground that was frozen 4 inches deep, and the ground stayed frozen long after the snow was gone. Neil Tarleton came every Saturday and every Sunday at 7 a.m. for 16 weekends straight. He brought lumber, He brought water. He brought tools that he loaned to Adelaide and then taught her how to use. He brought the kind of patience that an old man has for a piece of work that he knows will outlast him. By the end of June, they had pulled out the rotten rafters in the freight room and replaced them with new lumber, sistered to the original framing, the joints toenailed, in the way that Neil's father had taught Neil, and that Adelaide could feel in her shoulders 3 days after every weekend. They had stripped the old shingles off the freight room roof and laid down new tar paper and cedar shakes, the kind of shakes that would last 60 years if they were laid right. They had excavated 3 feet down around the base of the chimney on the western side where the foundation had settled, and they had poured a concrete underpinning that had cured for 14 days before they had started the slow, course-by-course rebuild of the chimney itself. Adelaide's hands had blistered and bled and calloused over and blistered again, and now they were the hands of someone who did real work for a living. Her shoulders had filled out. Her face had thinned. She had lost almost 10 pounds in 6 weeks, and Neil had started bringing her sandwiches in addition to the coffee and sugar, because he had told her plainly that she was burning more calories than she was eating, and that a body that did not eat enough did not heal at night, and a body that did not heal at night did not last through a Pennsylvania winter. She ate the sandwiches. In the second week of June, on a Wednesday afternoon when Neil was not there, a man pulled up to the depot in a Ford F-15. Oh, that was perhaps 20 years old. He got out slowly. He was perhaps 70, with a thin gray ponytail tied at the back of his neck, a flannel shirt buttoned all the way to the collar despite the heat and the particular careful walk of a man whose knees had been broken and never quite reset properly. He stopped at the edge of the platform. He looked up at the depot for a long moment without saying anything. Adelaide came out of the waiting room with mortar on her hands. "Can I help you, sir?" The man did not answer right away. He was looking at the sign above the bay window. Hartwell Junction, Pen RR. The letters were still faded, still weathered, but the bones of the lettering were visible if you knew how to look at it. "I'm Wendell Pritchard," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, like someone who had not used it much that day. "I worked as a dispatcher on this division from 1963 until 1998. I never thought I would see this building still standing. I was driving up from Altoona, and I heard on the radio that a young woman was restoring it, and I drove out here to see if it was true, and I have been sitting in my truck for 10 minutes trying to figure out whether I was going to get out, because I did not think I could stand to find out it was not." He took off his cap. His hair was thin on top gray, and there was something in the way he held the cap against his chest that made Adelaide think of Neil Tarleton on the first night. "Miss," he said, "would you mind if I came up onto the platform? Please." Wendell Pritchard climbed the platform steps slowly one at a time, gripping the railing, the way a man grips a railing when he does not entirely trust his knees. He stopped at the top. He looked at the new shakes on the freight room roof. He looked at the rebuilt western corner of the chimney. He looked at the platform boards that Adelaide and Neil had replaced, the new pressure-treated lumber, bright against the old weathered planks they had not gotten to yet. "You're doing it right," he said. "Mr. Tarleton is teaching me." "Cornelius Tarleton?" "Yes, sir. Cornelius Tarleton was the best mason in 3 counties before he retired. If he is teaching you, you will learn it the right way." Adelaide led him into the waiting room and then into the ticket office, and Wendell Pritchard stood in the small square room and looked at the high desk facing the bay window and the row of pigeonholes in the chalkboard that still showed the last entry from June 17, 1960. He did not cry, but his shoulders moved once tightly the way old men's shoulders move when they are not going to cry, but their bodies have decided to acknowledge something anyway. I met Hollis Pierce twice, he said. Once in 1959 when I was a kid trying to get a job on the railroad. Once in 1960 when the line was closing. He made a pot of coffee for every crew that came through every morning for 26 years. It was not part of his job. He just did it. There were railroad men on this division who learned the schedule of his coffee pot the way they learned the schedule of the trains. Adelaide showed him the diary. She showed him the September 14th entry. Wendell Pritchard read it, standing in the ticket office with the afternoon light coming through the bay window, and when he was done, he handed the diary back to her, and his face had changed. Miss Whitmore, there is a man in Bedford County named Howard Lemke. He is 87 years old. In 1963, when I was first hired as a dispatcher, Howard Lemke was an investigator with the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission. He spent 4 years investigating Harlan Devlin's quarry company. He never quite got him. The case fell apart in 1967, and Howard always said it fell apart because someone in the commission was on Harlan's payroll, and the documents he needed for the prosecution kept disappearing from the file room. Wendell Pritchard paused. Howard Lemke kept his own copies. At home, in a filing cabinet in his basement. He used to joke about it at retirement parties. He used to say that someday someone was going to come knocking on his door asking about Harlan Devlin, and he was going to be the only man in this state who still had the paperwork to answer the question. Will he talk to me? Miss Whitmore, I think Howard Lemke has been waiting 60 years for someone to come ask him about the Devlins. I think he will talk to you for as long as you can sit in a chair. Howard Lemke lived in a small house at the end of a gravel road outside the town of Everett. The house had a wraparound porch that needed paint and a vegetable garden that did not need anything because the man who tended it knew exactly what he was doing. Adelaide and Wendell Pritchard pulled up in Wendell's Ford, and an old man in a cardigan came out onto the porch to meet them, holding a glass of iced tea in one hand and a manila folder in the other. Wendell, he said, took you long enough. Howard, this is Adelaide Whitmore. I know who she is. The radio's been talking about her for 2 weeks. Come inside. The basement is cooler than the porch, and I have spent the last 3 days going through files I have not opened since 1974. The basement of Howard Lemke's house was lined with metal filing cabinets that had been bought at a government surplus auction in 1978, and every one of them was full. He led Adelaide and Wendell to a long wooden table where he had laid out in neat stacks the work of 3 days of preparation. Miss Whitmore, he said, sitting down slowly across from her. Wendell tells me that Garrett Devlin has come to your depot and offered you $18,000 for it. He tells me that you said no. He tells me that Cornelius Tarleton is helping you rebuild it and that you intend to keep saying no for as long as it takes. Is all of that correct? Yes, sir. Then I am going to tell you what I have here, and I am going to tell you what I think it means, and then I am going to tell you what I think you should do about it. Is that acceptable? Yes, sir. He opened the first folder. Between 1956 and 1968, the Devlin Quarry Company acquired 41 parcels of land in 3 counties of central Pennsylvania, almost all of it through forced sales, foreclosures, or transfers from the railroad at prices that were a small fraction of fair market value. I documented 34 of those 41 parcels as having been acquired through bribery or coercion. In every case, there was an inspector or an official who signed off on a paperwork irregularity that should not have been signed off on, and in every case, that inspector or official either received a sudden infusion of cash or received a promotion, or in 3 cases vanished from the public record entirely after the transfer was complete. In 4 cases, the previous owner of the property died within 12 months of refusing to sell. in circumstances that the local sheriffs ruled accidental, but that I, having reviewed the case files, did not believe were accidental at all. He closed the folder. I could not prove any of it in court. Harlan Devlin had a lawyer named Frank Geist, who was the best evidentiary lawyer in this part of the state, and every time I built a case, Frank Geist found a procedural reason to dismantle it. The case officially closed in 1967. I retired in 1992. And then yesterday morning, Wendell called me, and I went down to my basement and I started pulling files because what I have here, Miss Whitmore, is not just the record of what Harlan Devlin did 60 years ago. It is the record of how the Devlin family does business. The pattern, the signature, the way they break a property loose from the people who own it. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the table to her. This is a summary I prepared yesterday of the 7 properties Garrett Devlin has acquired in the last 15 years. I have cross-referenced his acquisitions against his grandfather's. The methods are not just similar, they are identical. Same sequence of inspections, same kind of paperwork irregularities. Same cash transfers, only now they go through 3 layers of LLC instead of 1. The Devlins did not change their playbook in 3 generations. They just got better at hiding it. Adelaide looked at the sheet, the names of the 7 properties, the dates, the shell companies, the pattern of inspections that had always somehow found in Garrett Devlin's favor. Mr. Lemke, why didn't anyone stop him? Because nobody had the documents to prove the pattern. The current investigators only see Garrett. They do not see Harlan. They do not see the line connecting the two. I am the only person alive who has all of this paperwork in one place. That is why he has never been caught. Howard Lemke leaned back in his chair. Miss Whitmore, I am 87 years old. My wife died 4 years ago. My children live in California and Oregon. I have been waiting for someone to ask me about Harlan Devlin for almost 40 years. If you are willing to take this fight to the place where it needs to go, I will give you everything I have. Photocopies, originals, sworn affidavits. I will go to the witness stand if I am still alive when this gets to a courtroom. I am not going to die without seeing this family answer for what they have done. He pushed the manila folder across the table. This is yours now. The radio piece aired on the second Friday in July. Margot Sinclair had spent 2 months working on it, sitting at the kitchen table in her apartment in Bedford with the documents Howard Lemke had given her, spread out in front of her calling sources, verifying every claim 3 times the way a real journalist still did the work, even when most of her colleagues had stopped doing it that way. She had interviewed Adelaide once briefly, but the piece was not about Adelaide. The piece was about a 60-year pattern of property acquisition by a single family in central Pennsylvania that had relied on the cooperation of public officials who should not have been cooperating. The piece named 4 current and former inspectors. It named 2 members of the Pine Ridge Township Board. It quoted 3 former employees of Garrett Devlin's development company anonymously, who had described in detail how cash payments were structured to avoid creating paper trails. It cited Howard Lemke's documentation. It cited the diary entry of Hollis Pierce, the September 14, 1958 entry, read aloud in Margot's calm, careful voice on the air. The piece ran for 43 minutes. It was the longest piece the station had ever broadcast. Within 24 hours, the Pennsylvania Office of the Attorney General had announced that it was opening a formal inquiry. Within 72 hours, the FBI's Pittsburgh field office had requested a copy of Howard Lemke's documentation. Within a week, 2 of the 4 named inspectors had retained criminal defense attorneys. Garrett Devlin did not respond publicly to the piece. He did not make a statement. He did not file a defamation suit, although Margot Sinclair had been ready for one. He went silent. The kind of silence that is not absence but presence. The kind of silence that watches. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July, Adelaide came back to the depot from a trip into Bedford to pick up a load of cider shakes, and she found the front door of the waiting room standing open. She had locked it. She always locked it now. She set down the shakes very quietly on the platform. She unhooked the framing hammer from her tool belt. She walked to the open door, and she stood on the threshold and she listened. The waiting room was empty. The bench was where she had left it. The pot-bellied stove was where she had left it. The candle she had blown out before leaving that morning was still on the windowsill. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been broken. But the ticket office door was open, and she had closed that door before leaving. And when she walked through it, she saw immediately what had happened. The diary was on the agent's desk. Open to the September 14th, 1958 entry. The page had been torn out. Not cleanly. Roughly the way a man tears a page when he is angry, when he wants to destroy something but does not quite have the time to do it carefully. A jagged edge ran down the inside of the binding where the page had been. Adelaide stood in the ticket office, and she felt her heart beat against the chronometer at her collarbone, and she felt the cold come up through the slate floor into the soles of her boots, and she felt the world get very narrow and very clear. Then she walked back to the platform. She got her phone out of her jacket pocket. She opened the photo gallery. She scrolled back 2 months. There it was. She had photographed every page of the diary on the night she had read it for the first time, sitting on the wooden bench with the candle on the windowsill behind her. She had photographed it because Neil Tarleton had told her to photograph it. He had said the first weekend he had come back that any document worth keeping in this part of the world was a document worth keeping in 2 places, and that the second place ought to be a place that nobody could break into with a crowbar. The September 14th, 1958 entry was on her phone, every word of it. She went back into the ticket office. She looked at the torn binding. She looked at the small flecks of paper on the desk where the page had come away from the spine. She looked at the diary, which had been Hollis Pierce's diary, which had been hidden in the chimney for 66 years, which had been entrusted to her by a building that had been waiting. Garrett Devlin had committed a crime, a real crime, breaking and entering, tampering with evidence in an open federal investigation, destruction of historical material that was, as of a township vote 3 weeks earlier, formally designated as protected. He had not done any of it himself. He had sent someone, but he had done it, and he had not known about the photographs. Adelaide called Wendell Pritchard. "Wendell, someone broke into the depot. They tore the September 14th entry out of the diary. I have it on my phone, every page. Photographs." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Wendell's voice came back slow and careful. "Miss Whitmore, do not touch anything in that ticket office. Do not move the diary. Do not clean up the paper flecks. I am calling Margot Sinclair, and I am calling the FBI field office in Pittsburgh, and I am driving up there now. We are going to document this exactly the way it sits, and we are going to add it to what we already have, and we are going to nail him to the wall with it." "Wendell?" "Yes." "Tell Margot to wait 3 days before she puts it on the air." "Why?" "Because I want him to think he got away with it. I want him to come back. I want to know what he is going to try next." Wendell was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Miss Whitmore, your grandfather would have said the exact same thing." The second township board meeting was in the 3rd week of November. Garrett Devlin had filed a petition signed by 52 residents demanding that the depot be declared a public hazard and demolished immediately. The petition argued that the building attracted vagrants, lowered surrounding property values, and created liability for the township. Most of the 52 signatures were Garrett's business associates and their wives. Some of them were employees of his development company. Two of them were members of the township board itself, which was a procedural irregularity that Beatrice Holloway had quietly flagged for the meeting record. Adelaide came to the meeting with Neil Tarleton on her left and Wendell Pritchard on her right, and Margot Sinclair sitting in the audience with a notebook open on her knee. Howard Lemke had driven up from Everett that morning and was sitting in the front row, his cardigan buttoned, his hands folded in his lap, the manila folder on the chair beside him. Garrett Devlin presented for 15 minutes. He had photographs. He had updated estimates. He had a binder. When he sat down, Calvin Mercer, the township supervisor, looked at Adelaide. "Miss Whitmore, do you have a response?" She stood up. She did not have a binder. She did not have photographs. She had her hands, which had calluses on top of calluses, and she had the chronometer at her collarbone, and she had the manila folder that Howard Lemke had given her 3 months earlier, and she had the truth. She spoke for 22 minutes. She told the board what she had built. She told them that the chimney was rebuilt and certified by a master mason. She told them that the freight room roof was sound. She told them that the foundation had been underpinned and the platform replaced. She told them what she intended to do with the building, which was to keep it open as a coffee station for whoever came down the old railbed trail, the way Hollis Pierce had kept it open for whoever came down the railroad. Then she set the manila folder on the table in front of her. "Mr. Mercer, the petition Mr. Devlin has filed asks this board to take an action that would be in the financial interest of one specific developer. 2 members of this board have signed the petition. Those 2 members are also named in an active federal investigation into Mr. Devlin's business practices. I am asking formally that those 2 members recuse themselves from the vote on the petition, and I am asking also formally that the contents of this folder be entered into the public record of this meeting." Howard Lemke stood up in the front row. "My name is Howard Lemke. I am 87 years old. I retired from the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission in 1992. I am the original investigator on a case that documented criminal activity by the Devlin family between 1956 and 1968. The folder Miss Whitmore is offering to this board contains the original case file, every page of it. I am willing to swear to its contents under oath in any court in this state." The room went very quiet. The 2 township board members, whose names were on Garrett Devlin's petition, did not move. They did not speak. One of them looked at Garrett, who was sitting in the second row. Garrett did not look back at them. Calvin Mercer cleared his throat. "The chair acknowledges the request for recusal. The 2 members are excused from the vote." The vote was 4 in favor of denying the petition, 0 against, 2 recused. Garrett Devlin stood up before the gavel had finished falling. He picked up his binder. He walked out of the meeting room without looking at anyone, and he kept walking through the small lobby, and he pushed open the front door of the municipal building and went out into the November dark. Adelaide followed him out. She did not know why she did it. She had not planned to. But she stood up and she walked out of the meeting room and she pushed open the same door he had pushed open, and she stood on the steps of the municipal building in the cold, and she watched him walk to his black pickup truck across the parking lot. He stopped at the door of his truck. He turned around. He saw her standing there. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he walked back across the parking lot toward her. He stopped 6 feet away from her at the bottom of the steps. He looked up at her. The yellow light from the porch fixture above the municipal building door fell on his face, and for the first time since she had met him in the waiting room of the depot in March, she could see what he looked like underneath the steel gray hair and the wool overcoat and the careful blank expression. He looked like a man who had not slept much in 8 months. He looked like a man who had just understood fully that he was going to lose. "You are going to wish," he said, "that you had taken the 18,000. "No, sir," Adelaide said, "I am not." He looked at her for a long time. The chronometer ticked at her collarbone. Then he turned and he walked back to his truck and he got in and he drove away. Adelaide stood on the steps of the municipal building until his taillights had disappeared down the road. The cold worked its way through her jacket. The wind moved in the bare branches of the trees that lined the parking lot. The door behind her opened. Neil Tarleton stepped out onto the steps beside her. "Miss Whitmore." "Neil, you all right?" "Yes, sir. It is going to get worse before it gets better." He just lost in front of his own town. Men like that do not lose in front of their own town and walk away. He has one more move in him. "I know. And then it will be over." "I know that too." Neil Tarleton stood beside her in the cold for another minute without saying anything. Then he put his hand briefly on her shoulder, the way Ezra Whitmore had once put his hand briefly on Neil Tarleton's shoulder in 1976, on the day they had finished framing the new workshop. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The winter that followed was the hardest of Adelaide's life. The temperature dropped to 5 above zero in the second week of December and stayed below 10 for 19 days straight. The roads into Payne-Rich Township iced over in early January, and the township could not afford to send the plows out more than once every other day, and there were stretches of 72 hours in which Adelaide saw no other human being and heard no engine and no voice, only the wind in the trees behind the depot and the creak of the building contracting in the cold, and the steady ticking of the 2 chronometers on the agent's desk in the ticket office. She fed the wood stove every 3 hours, day and night. She slept in 2-hour blocks, waking to add wood, going back to sleep. She lost 8 pounds. Her jaw ached from clenching it against the cold. The water in her gallon jug froze inside the building if she did not keep it within 4 feet of the stove. But she did not freeze. Beatrice Holloway came every Wednesday with soup. Neil Tarleton came every Saturday with firewood. Wendell Pritchard came every Sunday with a thermos of coffee and the morning paper. Howard Lemke called her on the phone twice a week and asked her how she was eating and how she was sleeping, the way an old man asks questions when he has decided that someone is more or less his. The phone call from Hattie Donovan came on a Thursday afternoon in the last week of January. Adelaide was splitting kindling on the platform when her phone rang. The voice on the other end was not Hattie's. It was a woman who introduced herself as the day manager at Hattie's Diner in Harrisburg, and she said the words that Adelaide had been afraid of hearing for almost a year without knowing she had been afraid of hearing them. Hattie had collapsed behind the counter that morning. A stroke. The ambulance had taken her to Hershey Medical Center. The day manager had found Adelaide's number on a card taped to the inside of the cash register with the word "daughter" written above it in Hattie's handwriting. Adelaide put down the splitting maul. She did not remember what she said to the woman on the phone. She remembered that she walked to the truck Neil Tarleton had loaned her for the winter, and she drove 4 hours through ice and slush to a hospital she had never been to, and she sat in a waiting room for 6 hours until a doctor came out and told her that Hattie Donovan was alive, but would need surgery on a heart valve, and that the surgery had a 70% success rate, and that Hattie was 64 years old and frightened and asking for her. Adelaide sat beside the hospital bed for 2 days. Hattie was smaller than Adelaide had ever seen her. The woman who had run a diner alone for 30 years, who had given a 16-year-old runaway a room above the kitchen and asked no questions, who had given a 20-year-old homeless woman the same room 4 years later and asked no questions, then either lay in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and her hair flat against the pillow and her hand on the white sheet looked like the hand of an old woman and not the hand of the Hattie Adelaide had known. But her eyes were sharp. Her eyes were Hattie's eyes. "Kid," she said the first time she was awake enough to talk, "you drove all this way." "Yes, ma'am." "You should not have." "Yes, ma'am, I should have." Hattie closed her eyes. She held Adelaide's hand. She did not let go for a long time. On the second day, when the surgery had been scheduled and Hattie's color was coming back, the older woman gripped Adelaide's hand and said in a voice that had not entirely returned that she could not run the diner alone anymore, that she needed to hire help, real help, 2 people full-time, and that she did not have the money to do it, that she was thinking about selling and that selling would kill her faster than any heart valve. Adelaide thought about a room above a diner, a locked door 11 blocks away, a woman who had taken her in at 16 and again at 20 without asking a single question. She thought about Hollis Pierce hiding $6,800 in a chimney for someone he would never meet. "Hattie," Adelaide said, "I have $20,000 I do not need this winter. It is yours. 5 years, no interest, you pay me back when you can." Hattie closed her eyes, her hand tightened on Adelaide's. "Kid," she said, "you do not have $20,000. I have 22,400. I am giving you 20. The rest will get me through to spring." "Adelaide." "Hattie, you gave me a room. Take the money." Hattie took the money. The diner hired 2 people. Hattie survived the surgery. The check Adelaide wrote that afternoon dropped her account to $2,400, and the indictment of Garrett Devlin was still 2 weeks away, and the letter from Bennett Pierce had not yet arrived, and Adelaide drove back to Hartwell Junction in the dark with the chronometer ticking against her collarbone and the empty bank account ticking quietly behind it, and she did not regret what she had done for 1 second of the long drive home. In the second week of February, the federal indictment came down. Garrett Devlin was charged with 17 counts of bribery, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit fraud, 1 count of breaking and entering, 1 count of tampering with evidence in a federal investigation, and 1 count of destruction of protected historical material. 2 township board members were named as co-conspirators. 4 state inspectors were named. The FBI's Pittsburgh field office held a press conference. Margot Sinclair stood in the back of the room with her notebook open, and she did not smile, but she also did not look away. That same week, in the same week that the indictment was unsealed, a letter came to the Pine Ridge Township office addressed to the new owner of the Hartwell Junction Depot. Beatrice Holloway brought it out to the depot herself. She handed it across the wood stove to Adelaide without a word. The handwriting on the envelope was shaky. The return address was in a neighborhood of Philadelphia that Adelaide did not recognize. The letter inside was 3 paragraphs long. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I heard the radio piece your friend Margot Sinclair broadcast in July. I have been listening to it again and again on the recording she sent me. My name is Bennett Pierce. I am 91 years old. I am the son of Hollis Pierce. I left Hartwell Junction in April of 1957 after an argument with my father about my future, and I never spoke to him again. He died in 1962. I have lived for 68 years believing that he died angry with me. I would very much like to come and read his diary. If this is acceptable, please write to me at this address. My grandson Spencer can drive me. We can come whenever you say. I do not have very much time. Please, I would like to see the depot one more time before I die. Bennett Pierce." Adelaide held the letter in both hands. The chronometers ticked on the desk in the ticket office. Beatrice Holloway sat across from her on the wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not speak. Outside the bay window, the wind was picking up across the empty railbed. The sun was setting behind the western ridge line, and the last light came in through the cracked glass and lay across the slate floor of the waiting room in long gold rectangles, the way it had lain across this same floor for almost 140 years every winter evening, whether or not anyone was inside the building to see it. 68 years. That was how long Bennett Pierce had been waiting for permission he had never thought he would receive from a father he had believed had died refusing it. The depot had been waiting for him too, the way it had been waiting for Adelaide, the way it waited for everyone who eventually came. Adelaide picked up a pen. Bennett Pierce arrived on the first Thursday of March in a gray Buick, driven by a man in his late 50s, with the same long, patient face that had once belonged to Hollis Pierce in the photograph Wendell Pritchard had brought to the depot in October. Adelaide was waiting on the platform. She'd built a small fire in the wood stove that morning, so the waiting room would be warm when they arrived, and she had brewed a fresh pot of coffee and set out 3 mugs on the high desk in the ticket office, the way Hollis Pierce had set out mugs every morning for 26 years for crews that were not his responsibility. The Buick stopped at the edge of the platform. The grandson got out first. Spencer Pierce, 58 years old, the kind of careful, deliberate man who knew exactly how slowly he was going to need to move when he opened the passenger door for his grandfather. He nodded to Adelaide once the way a man nods who is about to do something difficult and does not want any sound to break the air around it. Then he went around the car. He opened the passenger door. Bennett Pierce came out of the car slowly. He used a cane. His left hand gripped the door frame, and his right hand gripped the cane, and his grandson held him under the elbow, and he stood for a long moment beside the car with his eyes closed, breathing. He was 91 years old. He was wearing a navy wool overcoat that had been beautiful when it had been bought perhaps 30 years ago, and that was still beautiful now in the way that good wool stays beautiful even after a man has lost 3 inches of his height to age. His hair was white. His face was the face of a man who had spent his life paying attention to things and who was now trying to decide whether he could bear to pay attention to one more. He opened his eyes. He looked at the depot. He looked at the sign above the bay window. Hartwell Junction, Pen RR. The letters Adelaide and Neil had carefully restored over the course of 3 weekends in October, repainted in the original colors by a sign maker in Pittsburgh who specialized in historic typography. Bennett Pierce looked at that sign for almost a full minute. He did not move. He did not speak. His grandson stood beside him with one hand under his elbow and waited. Then he turned his head very slowly and he looked at Adelaide where she stood on the platform. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, sir." "My father stood in the place you are standing. 10,000 mornings he stood there. I came up out of that car expecting to feel like I was visiting a grave. I do not feel like I am visiting a grave. No, sir. What do I feel like?" He said it not as a question to her, but as a question to himself, the way old men sometimes ask themselves questions out loud because the people they used to ask them to are gone. He answered himself, "I feel like he just stepped out for a minute." Spencer Pierce helped his grandfather up the platform steps. They moved one step at a time, the cane finding the next plank, then the next foot, then the cane again. Adelaide held the waiting room door open. Bennett Pierce paused on the threshold. He looked into the waiting room. He looked at the wainscoting. He looked at the wooden bench where as a boy he had sat between trains and watched his father work. He looked at the pot-bellied stove where a fire was burning, now the way fires had once burned every winter morning in this same stove. He stepped inside. He stopped 2 feet into the room. That smell, Sir, coffee and pine smoke and old paper. I have not smelled that in 68 years. I have not smelled that anywhere on earth. He walked to the ticket office door. Spencer started to help him, and Bennett gently lifted the grandson's hand off his elbow, not unkindly, but with the firmness of a man who needed to walk this last 20 feet by himself. He crossed the waiting room with his cane. He pushed the ticket office door open. He stepped inside. He stood in the small square room. He looked at the high desk. He looked at the row of pigeonholes. He looked at the chalkboard where the last entry was still ghosted faintly. 7:15 a.m. Westbound. Late. He looked at the iron safe in the corner. He looked at the bay window and at the cracked glass through which his father had looked for 26 years. He looked finally at the desk. The diary was lying on it. Adelaide had placed it there an hour earlier, closed with a small piece of weathered ribbon marking the first page. Bennett Pierce sat down on the agent's stool. He pulled the diary across the desk toward himself with both hands. He did not open it immediately. He laid his palm flat on the cracked leather cover, and he held it there. His grandson stood in the doorway behind him, and Adelaide stood beside the grandson, and neither of them spoke. After a long time, Bennett Pierce opened the diary. He read for almost 2 hours. The afternoon light moved across the slate floor of the ticket office and climbed the western wall and faded out of the room, and Spencer brought his grandfather a glass of water and set it gently at the corner of the desk, and Bennett Pierce read page by page the daily log of his father's 26 years at Hartwell Junction. The passenger counts and the freight tonnage and the weather conditions. The small notes about Bennett's own boyhood, the entries that mentioned bringing him to work, teaching him to fill out waybills, watching him grow. The entry for November 2nd, 1956, the day Bennett had received his railroad inspector's badge. The line that read, "I engraved the backstand firm on right track," his mother's words, and I hope he remembers them. He read the entry for April 2nd, 1957, the morning his father had come to the station, and found the inspector's badge on the desk where Bennett had left it, and the entries that followed the months of silence in the diary, the blank pages. He read the entry for January 1960, in which Hollis had written that the line was closing and that he was going to leave the cash box in the chimney for whoever came next, perhaps Bennett, perhaps a stranger. He read the final entry, dated June 17th, 1960. When he reached the line in that entry that read, "The badge belongs to my son. If you find him someday, tell him I should have listened. Tell him his mother would have been proud of him for choosing his own path." His shoulders began to shake. He did not make a sound. His grandson stepped forward into the ticket office and stood behind him and put both hands on the old man's shoulders, and Bennett Pierce sat at his father's desk and wept in absolute silence. And the chronometers ticked on the desk in front of him, his father's chronometer and Adelaide's grandfather's chronometer, side by side in perfect time. Adelaide stepped out of the doorway. She walked back into the waiting room. She sat down on the wooden bench beside the pot-bellied stove, and she watched the fire through the small mica window in the stove door, and she gave Bennett Pierce the privacy he had earned by living for 91 years and waiting 68 of them for a single page of paper to tell him something he had needed to know. When he came out of the ticket office an hour later, his eyes were red and his face was composed. He held the diary against his chest with both hands. His grandson walked beside him. They sat down across from Adelaide at the small wooden table she had set up near the bay window in the waiting room, and Spencer went out to the car and came back with a leather satchel. Bennett Pierce set the satchel on the table. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "my father saved that money for someone he would never meet. He trusted that whoever found it would need it badly enough to honor it. You have honored it. I have read his diary, and I have seen what you have done with this building, and I want to do something now on his behalf that I think he would have wanted me to do." He opened the satchel. He took out a checkbook and a manila envelope. He laid them both on the table. "The check is for $40,000. The envelope contains paperwork that with your signature will establish a trust at the Bedford Credit Union for the perpetual maintenance of this depot. You will be the trustee. The principal will be invested conservatively. The interest will pay for repairs, taxes, supplies, and any other costs associated with keeping this building open as a public space. There is one condition." "Yes, sir." "You will serve free coffee here every day to anyone who comes, the way my father did for the railroad crews. That is the only condition. Can you agree to that?" Adelaide looked at the man across the table from her. She looked at his hands holding the checkbook. She looked at the satchel. She looked at Spencer beside him, and at the diary lying on the table between them, and at the cracked bay window through which the late afternoon sun was coming in on her face. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can agree to that." "Good." He picked up the pen that Spencer had set beside the checkbook, and he wrote out the check, and he signed his name, and he tore it carefully along the perforation, and he placed it on the table between them. Then he opened the manila envelope, and he turned it toward her, and he showed her where to sign on the trust document. Adelaide signed her name in the careful slanted script her grandfather had taught her when she was 7 years old. Bennett Pierce sat back in his chair. He closed his eyes for a moment, then he opened them. "Miss Whitmore, I have one more thing I would like to ask you." "Yes, sir." "I would like to come back." "Sir, my grandson can drive me. We can come once a month. I would like to drink coffee here. I would like to sit on the platform. I would like to remember my father in the building where he spent the best years of his life. I would like, if you will permit it, to be a regular here the way the railroad crews used to be regulars when my father made coffee for them. I do not have very much time. I would like to spend some of what I have left in this building. You can come whenever you want." He smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it changed his face into a face she could imagine had once been 21 years old and full of conviction and stubborn certainty about what kind of life a man should live. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Bennett," he looked up. "My name is Adelaide. I would prefer that you call me Adelaide." "Adelaide?" "Yes." "Then you must call me Bennett." "Yes, sir." "Bennett, Bennett." He laughed, soft and brief, the laugh of a man who had not laughed in a long time and who was surprised by the sound of his own laughter. The federal trial of Garrett Devlin began on the second Monday of April in the United States District Court for the Western District of Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, and Adelaide Whitmore was called as a witness on the third day. She drove down with Wendell Pritchard in his Ford. Neil Tarleton came in a separate truck. Howard Lemke had been there since the opening arguments, sitting in the third row of the gallery in his cardigan, the manila folder closed on his lap. Margot Sinclair was in the press section with her notebook open. Bennett Pierce had asked Spencer to drive him, and they were sitting together near the back of the courtroom in matching wool overcoats, the old man's cane leaning against the bench beside him. Adelaide wore the clothes she had worn to the township board meeting in November. A clean flannel shirt, dark jeans, work boots. She had thought about borrowing something nicer, and Beatrice Holloway had told her plainly not to, because the jury was going to want to see her exactly the way she was. The jury was going to want to see the calluses on her hands. She sat in the witness box. She placed her right hand on the Bible. She swore to tell the truth. She gave her name. She gave her address as the Hartwell Junction Depot, Pine Ridge Township, Bedford County, Pennsylvania, And she watched the court reporter type it into the record, and she felt the chronometer tick at her collarbone, and she did not look at Garrett Devlin, who was sitting at the defense table 30 feet away, in a charcoal suit that did not quite fit him anymore. The prosecutor walked her through the events of March and through the discovery of the diary and through Garrett Devlin's first visit to the depot and through the November meeting at the township office and through the discovery of the torn page in July. Then the prosecutor asked her to identify the photograph she had taken of the September 14th, 1958 diary entry 2 months before that page had been torn out. She identified it. The prosecutor entered it into evidence. The prosecutor asked her if she had any reason to believe that the man who had broken into the depot had been acting on behalf of the defendant. Adelaide looked then for the first time at Garrett Devlin. He was looking back at her. His face had thinned over the winter. His hair, which had been steel gray in March, was almost white now. His hands were folded on the defense table in front of him. He did not look angry. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had spent 55 years building something that had collapsed in 8 months and who had not yet figured out what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. "Yes, sir," Adelaide said. "I do have reason to believe that." "What reason?" "He told me on the night he first came to the depot that I would not be the last person to stand on that property and refuse him, but that I would be the last person who refused him and walked away with anything at all. He told me on the steps of the township municipal building in November that I would wish I had taken his offer." The tearing of that page happened in July after the radio piece had aired and after the federal investigation had been announced. The page that was torn was the page that documented his grandfather's identical attempt to take that property in 1958. It was the only page in the diary that connected the defendant directly by family to a 60-year pattern of property acquisition through bribery and intimidation. That page being destroyed served exactly one person's interest, the defendant's. She did not raise her voice. She did not look away from him. "I am sorry that he wasted so many years of his life trying to take a building that was never going to be his." The prosecutor let the line sit. The jury looked at Adelaide. Then they looked at Garrett Devlin. He looked down at his hands. The cross-examination took 11 minutes. Garrett Devlin's attorney, a man from Philadelphia in a suit that did fit, tried twice to suggest that Adelaide had a financial motive for testifying against his client, that she stood to benefit from the trust fund Bennett Pierce had established, that she had been coached by the prosecution. Each time Adelaide answered him plainly and briefly, and each time the jury watched her hands, which were folded on the rail of the witness box, and they saw what those hands had done over the course of a year, and they were not persuaded. She stepped down from the witness box. She walked back up the aisle of the courtroom. She passed Garrett Devlin at the defense table, and she did not look at him, and he did not look at her. She sat down between Wendell Pritchard and Neil Tarleton in the gallery, and Neil Tarleton put his hand briefly on the back of her hand, and the trial continued. The verdict came back 6 days later. Garrett Devlin was convicted on 15 of the 17 bribery counts. Both conspiracy counts, the breaking and entering count, the tampering with evidence count, and the destruction of protected historical material count. He was sentenced 6 weeks later to 4 years in federal prison. The 2 township board members named as co-conspirators pleaded guilty in separate proceedings and resigned their positions. 3 of the 4 state inspectors took plea deals. The 4th went to trial and was convicted. Margot Sinclair won a regional journalism award for her coverage. She framed the certificate and hung it in her kitchen, and she went on with her work, and she came up to the depot every Friday for coffee, the way she had been doing since the previous summer. The day after the sentencing, the Pine Ridge Township Board met in special session and voted unanimously to formally remove the demolition order from the Hartwell Junction Depot to designate the building a historic landmark of Pennsylvania and to commission a bronze plaque to be installed on the platform commemorating Hollis Pierce Station Agent 1934 to 1960. Calvin Mercer drove out to the depot to deliver the news himself. He stood on the platform in his township jacket. He looked at the rebuilt chimney. He looked at the freight room roof. He looked at Adelaide, and he looked at the bronze plaque sitting on the platform railing in its cardboard box waiting to be installed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I should have backed you sooner. I want you to know that I know that." "Yes, sir." "I am sorry." "Yes, sir." He nodded once. He walked back to his truck. He drove away. Vivian Harper came to the depot on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, almost 14 months after she had locked her daughter out of the row house in Harrisburg. She came in a Toyota sedan that Adelaide did not recognize. She got out slowly. She had aged. She had lost weight in a way that did not look like health. Her clothes were chosen carefully, the way a woman chooses clothes when she is trying to project a stability she does not feel. She stood beside her car at the edge of the platform with her hands clasped in front of her, and she did not approach the depot. She waited. Adelaide came out onto the platform. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved in the trees behind the building. A bird called once from the rail bed and was answered from somewhere farther up the line. The two chronometers ticked in the ticket office, and the chronometer at Adelaide's collarbone ticked under her shirt, and Vivian Harper stood at the edge of the platform with her hands folded. "Adelaide?" "Yes." "I heard the radio piece last summer. I have been listening to it again. Margot Sinclair sent me a recording when I asked her for one 2 weeks ago. I have listened to it 11 times. "All right." "I left Roland in February, the day the indictment came down. I do not know if those two things are related. I have a therapist who tells me not to assume that they are. I am living in Bedford now. I have an apartment. I work at the public library 2 days a week. I came to explain, not to ask forgiveness. I do not deserve forgiveness. Just to explain." Adelaide stood on the platform. She did not invite her mother up. "All right." Vivian Harper drew in a breath. She let it out. "When your father died, I died with him. I know that is not fair to you. You lost your father, and then you lost your mother also because I could not function. I could not see anything except his absence. When Roland came along, he was someone who did not remind me of Theodore. He did not talk about railroads. He did not smell like steel. He did not make me remember. But you did. Every time I looked at you, I saw your father's eyes and your grandfather's stubbornness and everything I had lost. And instead of loving you harder because you were what I had left of him, I pushed you away. Because looking at you hurt, and Roland told me I did not have to hurt, and I chose to believe him." Tears were running down her face. She did not move to wipe them away. "I changed the locks. I put the chronometer on top of the cardboard box. I knew what I was doing when I did it. I knew exactly what that watch meant. Roland told me it would make you come crawling back. It did not. You walked away. You walked 11 blocks in March cold to a diner I did not even know existed, and I did not know where you were for 2 weeks until I called Hattie Donovan, and she told me you were safe and I should not call her again unless I was ready to be your mother, and I was not ready and I did not call. For 13 months I did not call. And then the radio piece came on, and I heard your name, and I heard what you had built, and I understood that I was not the woman I had thought I was, and I have not been able to live inside my own skin since." Adelaide did not answer. The wind moved in the trees. I'm not asking to be in your life, Vivian said. I am asking to be in your peripheral vision. I would like to come and drink coffee the way the strangers come and drink coffee. I would like to wash mugs. I would like to pull weeds. If eventually you are willing to speak to me about something other than the depot, I would like that. If you are not, I will accept that. I have no claim on you. I lost my claim. I am asking only for what you choose to give. Adelaide looked at her mother. She thought about Hollis Pierce and Bennett Pierce, 64 years apart, both of them apologizing into a silence that the other could not hear. She thought about the diary entry that read, "I should have listened." She thought about the price of locked doors and the price of words not said while they could still be heard. She did not know if she could forgive the woman standing at the edge of the platform. She did know that she did not want to be the person who could not eventually find a way. "You can come for coffee," Adelaide said. "I am not going to call you Mom. I do not know what you are to me right now. I understand. You can come on Wednesdays, the same time, 2 o'clock. That is when I make a fresh pot. Thank you. Do not thank me. Just come or do not come. That is up to you." Vivian nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She got back into the Toyota. She drove away. Adelaide stood on the platform and watched the car disappear up the access road. She did not cry. The crying was somewhere underneath in a place she would visit later alone when the work of the day was done. For now she had a stove to feed and 3 boxes of supplies to move from the platform into the freight room and a bronze plaque to install in the morning when Neil Tarleton came up to help her with it. She went back inside. Vivian Harper came on Wednesdays at 2 o'clock for the rest of the spring and through the summer. She did not push. She washed mugs. She pulled weeds out of the small herb garden that Adelaide had started behind the freight room. She helped fold the dishcloths. She did not ask questions Adelaide had not invited. She drank her coffee and she stayed for an hour and she left. In the 3rd week of August on a Wednesday that was hotter than the Wednesdays that had come before it, Vivian arrived with a small wooden box under her arm. Adelaide saw it before her mother set it down on the table. It was the kind of box a man might keep on his dresser. Cherry wood, hand-cut dovetails, a small brass latch, the kind of box Theodore Whitmore had owned because his father had owned one before him. Adelaide set down the coffee pot. "Mom." It came out without her meaning it to. The first time she had said the word in 14 months. She did not take it back. Vivian set the box on the table. "This was your father's. I have had it in the closet of my bedroom for 13 years. I have not opened it in 13 years. I could not. There is a letter inside. He wrote it to you the week before he died. He gave it to me to give you on your 18th birthday. I did not give it to you. I could not look at the box, and I could not give it to you, and then you turned 18, and I told myself I would give it to you when you turned 20, and you turned 20, and I told myself I would give it to you when the time was right, and then I changed the locks. I am giving it to you now. I should have given it to you on your 18th birthday 2 years ago. I should have given it to you on every birthday before that. I am giving it to you now, and I know now is not when it was supposed to be given, and I am giving it to you anyway." Adelaide sat down across from her mother. She opened the box. Inside, on a folded square of dark cloth, lay an envelope. The envelope was addressed in her father's handwriting, which she recognized instantly even though she had not seen it in 13 years. It said simply, "Adelaide." She picked it up. Her hands were shaking. She opened it carefully the way she had opened the cash box in the chimney on the first night, the way her grandfather had taught her to open anything that mattered with care and with attention and without hurry, because the things that mattered did not reward speed. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper folded twice, and on it, her father had written in his careful engineer's hand, Adelaide. I am writing this on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table while you are asleep upstairs. You are 7 years old. You came down 20 minutes ago and asked me what I was doing, and I told you I was writing a letter, and you asked me who it was for, and I told you it was for someone I love very much, and you went back to bed satisfied with that answer. The work I do is not dangerous most days, but the bridge near Johnstown is dangerous, and I have been writing reports about it for almost 2 years now, and the company has not done what the reports say they should do. I do not know what is going to happen. I am writing this because your grandfather wrote a letter like this for me when I was small, and his father wrote one for him, and the men in our family write these letters because the work we do is the kind of work that does not always let a man come home, and a man who does not come home owes his children at least the courtesy of having said the things he would have said. So I am going to say them now. I love you. You are the best thing your mother and I ever did. You are smarter than I was at your age and braver, and you have a stubbornness that comes straight down through the Whitmore line. And I want you to keep that stubbornness for the rest of your life because it will be the thing that saves you on the days that nothing else will. Your grandfather has told me more than once that the men in our family work jobs that nobody sees. We maintain the signals, we inspect the bridges, we sit in the small stations, and we wait for the trains. The work is not glamorous. The work does not pay well. The work does not get put in the newspaper. But the work matters because somebody has to do it, and the people who do it well are the people who keep the rest of the world from falling apart. Adelaide, if you ever have to choose between comfort and integrity, choose integrity. That is the only thing your grandfather taught me that I would pass on to you without reservation. The world will offer you comfort, and the world will offer you 100 reasons to compromise. And most of those reasons will sound very persuasive at the time. But the men and women you will respect at the end of your life are the men and women who chose integrity every time, even when it was small, even when nobody was watching. That is the choice. Make it the way your grandfather made it and the way I have tried to make it, and you will be all right. I do not know who you will be when you read this. I hope you will be someone I would have liked. I think you will be. I think you already are. I love you. Your father. Adelaide read the letter twice. When she finished it the second time, she folded it very carefully along the same lines her father had folded it on a Tuesday evening at a kitchen table when she was 7 years old, and she put it back in the envelope. And she put the envelope back in the cherry wood box. She closed the box. She sat at the table across from her mother, and she could not speak, and she did not need to. Vivian reached across the table. Adelaide let her. Their hands touched on the table between them, and the chronometers ticked in the ticket office, and the wind moved in the trees behind the depot, and the building waited. The way it had waited for 66 years before Adelaide had walked across the platform on the worst night of her life, the way it would wait long after Adelaide herself was gone. Wendell Pritchard found the letters in October. He had been going through the last of the railroad memorabilia he had stored in his garage in Altoona, the boxes he had not yet sorted in the year since he had first come to the depot. He had been planning to bring everything to Hartwell Junction so that Adelaide could decide what to keep for the small archive she had started in the freight room and what to pass on to other historical societies. In the bottom of the third box, wrapped in butcher paper that had yellowed to the color of weak tea, he found a bundle of letters tied with a piece of frayed twine. The letters were addressed to Hollis Pierce Station Agent, Hartwell Junction Depot. They were postmarked from Philadelphia on dates ranging from June 1957 to December 1958. There were 19 of them. Every single one of them was marked in handwriting. Wendell Pritchard had come to know return to sender, but none of them had ever been sent back. Hollis Pierce had written return to sender on every envelope and then had not mailed a single one. He had kept them, all 19 of them, tied with twine, wrapped in butcher paper, stored somehow in a box that had been donated to the Historical Society after Hollis Pierce's death in 1962 and had ended up by chance or by the long, slow current of how things move in small towns in Wendell Pritchard's garage. Wendell drove down to the depot the next morning. Bennett Pierce was there. He came every first Saturday now with Spencer driving, and he sat at the small table in the waiting room with a mug of coffee and watched the visitors come and go. And on this first Saturday, he was sitting in his usual place when Wendell Pritchard came through the door with the bundle of letters in both hands. Wendell did not say anything. He set the bundle on the table in front of Bennett. Bennett looked at the bundle. He looked at the handwriting on the top envelope. It was his own handwriting from when he was 21 years old. He picked up the bundle. He turned it over slowly. He read the postmarks. He read the return to sender that his father had written across the front of every envelope in the careful, disciplined script of a man who had refused to open them, but had also refused somehow to send them back, and had instead kept them for 19 months until the box had been packed away. Bennett Pierce sat at the table in the waiting room of the Hartwell Junction Depot with the bundle of his own letters in his hands. He untied the twine. He opened the first envelope. The letter inside was dated June 20th, 1957, 2 months after he had left the inspector's badge on the desk and driven away. Dad, I am sorry. I was stupid. Please write back. He opened the second one. August 4th, 1957. Dad, the girl left me. You were right about her. I am sorry I did not listen. He opened the third, the fifth, the eighth, the 13th. He opened them all one by one in order, and he read what he had written 68 years earlier every month for 19 months to a father he had believed had thrown his letters away. The last letter, dated December 13th, 1958, was the longest. It was 4 pages. It was the letter of a young man who had finally understood after 18 months of writing into silence that his father was never going to write back. It was the letter of a young man making peace with that. It was the letter of a young man saying, finally, I love you and I am going to keep loving you, and I will not write again because I do not want to be a burden you cannot put down. I owe you my silence if that is what you have asked for. Goodbye. I love you. Bennett. Bennett Pierce had written for 19 months every month without fail into a silence he had believed was a refusal. It had not been a refusal. It had been a man who could not bring himself to open the letters, but who could not bring himself to throw them away either, and who had kept every single one of them in a box and had taken that box to the depot in the late 1950s and had stored it there with other personal items that the Historical Society had eventually inherited. His father had kept his letters. His father had kept them. Bennett Pierce sat at the table in the waiting room and he wept, and Spencer sat on one side of him and Adelaide sat on the other. And the visitors who came in for coffee that morning saw the old man weeping and said nothing, and Adelaide poured them coffee, and they took their mugs and went out onto the platform and gave him his privacy the way the railroad crews had once given Hollis Pierce his privacy on the mornings when something had happened that he did not want to talk about. Bennett Pierce was 91 years old. He had lived for 68 years believing his father had thrown his apologies away. His father had not thrown them away. His father had kept them all. 4 years later, on a morning in May when the air smelled like cut grass and the dogwoods were in bloom along the old railbed, Adelaide Whitmore stood on the platform of the Hartwell Junction Depot and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridgeline. She was 24 years old. The depot was open. The fire in the wood stove was warm. The pot of coffee was full. The two chronometers ticked on the desk in the ticket office side by side in perfect railroad time. The bronze plaque commemorating Hollis Pierce was bolted to the platform wall beside the historical landmark designation, and a second bronze plaque smaller installed the previous summer hung beside it. It read simply, "In memory of Bennett Pierce. He came home." Bennett had died in his sleep in February at the age of 93 in his apartment in Philadelphia with his father's diary on the bedside table and Spencer in the next room. Spencer had called Adelaide that morning. He had said only 6 words, which were, "My grandfather did not wake up," and he had hung up because he could not say any more, and Adelaide had stood in the ticket office of the Hartwell Junction Depot at 6:15 in the morning with the phone in her hand and the chronometer ticking against her collarbone, and she had cried for the first time in a way she had not cried since her father had died. Spencer had brought the diary back to the depot 6 weeks later, along with a letter Bennett had written for Adelaide in the last month of his life and had asked his grandson to deliver after the funeral. The letter had been short. "Adelaide, I came home because of you. I died knowing my father had loved me because of you. There is no debt I can pay you for that. I have asked Spencer to bring you the diary because it belongs in the building where it was written, and because you are the person my father was waiting for, and because I want it on the desk where he sat when you are pouring coffee for the strangers who come down the trail. Keep the chronometer wound. That is all I ask. Bennett." The diary sat now on the agent's desk in the ticket office between the two chronometers where it had sat for almost a year. Adelaide had kept the chronometer wound. The trust fund stood at $49,000. Adelaide had hired a part-time helper named Adeline, a teenager from Bedford who came on Saturdays and Sundays to learn how to make coffee the way Hollis Pierce had made it, and who listened patiently to the stories the regulars told, and who would perhaps someday be the one to take over when Adelaide was old. Vivian Whitmore, who had taken back her first married name after the divorce, lived in Bedford and came to the depot every Wednesday at 2 o'clock. She washed mugs. She pulled weeds. They did not talk about Roland or about the locked doors or about the cardboard box. They did sometimes talk about Theodore. Vivian had started slowly to be able to. She had brought the previous summer 3 more letters Theodore had written and never delivered, found in a drawer Vivian had finally been able to open. Adelaide had read them and had put them in the cherry wood box with the first letter, and the box now sat on the high desk in the ticket office beside the diary, beside the chronometers, the small archive of her family's silence finally being broken. Hattie Donovan's diner in Harrisburg was thriving. Her heart was strong. She had paid back $15,000 of the $20,000 Adelaide had loaned her, and the remaining $5,000 sat between them like a contract neither of them was in any hurry to close. She came up to the depot every other month and brought pies. She was 68 now and looked younger than she had at 64. She had hired a third person to help in the diner, and she worked 4 days a week instead of 7, and she had told Adelaide on her last visit that her doctor had said her heart was in better shape than it had been in 20 years. Cornelius Tarleton came every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. He brought pastries from the Bedford bakery. He sat on the platform and drank coffee with Adelaide, and they did not talk about much the way old friends do not talk about much, because they had already said the things that mattered. Wendell Pritchard came on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Howard Lemke came when his daughter could drive him up from the assisted living facility he had moved into the previous fall. Margot Sinclair came on Fridays and worked at her laptop in the corner of the waiting room because the depot was the quietest place she had ever found, and she could think there in a way she could not think anywhere else. Garrett Devlin had served 2.5 years of his 4-year sentence at a federal facility in West Virginia. The development company had been dissolved by court order in the second year of his incarceration. The 7 properties he had acquired through fraud had been returned to their original owners or to public trust. The 2 township board members who had taken his money had served 14 months each. A letter had arrived at the depot in October of the previous year, postmarked from a halfway house in Ohio. Adelaide had recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she had opened it. Steel gray careful, the handwriting of a man who had once worn wool overcoats to meetings he expected to win. The letter inside had been 1 paragraph long. Miss Whitmore, I am told by my counselor that I am supposed to write a letter to one person I have wronged in my life and that I am not supposed to expect a reply. I have chosen to write the letter to you. I do not know if my grandfather wronged Hollis Pierce in 1958. I do not know what kind of man my grandfather was because my father did not speak of him often, and the things my father did say about him, I have spent my life trying not to believe. What I know is that I came to your depot in March of 2 years ago, intending to take from you what I had been raised to believe was owed to me, and you stood in a doorway and said the word no, and I have spent 2 years inside a small room thinking about that word. I am writing to tell you that I have understood it. I do not ask anything from you. I only ask that you accept that I have understood it. Garrett Devlin. Adelaide had read the letter twice. Then she had folded it carefully along its existing creases. Then she had placed it in a small wooden box she kept on the high desk in the ticket office, the box where she kept the things that mattered, and she had not written back, and she had not thrown the letter away. She had kept it. The way Hollis Pierce had kept his son's letters for 19 months without opening them. The way the depot kept everything that came to it in the end. The depot was hers. The depot was the regulars. The depot was the strangers who came down the railbed trail and stopped for coffee and signed the visitor log and went on their way. Adelaide stood on the platform in the May morning. She wound the chronometer at her collarbone. She listened to it tick. She thought about Hollis Pierce, who had written on the last page of his diary on June 17, 1960, that a small station was a patient thing and that it waited for whoever would come next. She thought about her grandfather Ezra, who had told her that the men in their family worked the jobs nobody saw. She thought about her father Theodore, who had told her in a letter she had finally read at the kitchen table of a depot her mother had finally come to visit, that if she ever had to choose between comfort and integrity, she should choose integrity every time, even when it was small, even when nobody was watching. She had chosen. She thought about a 7-year-old girl at the kitchen table in a row house in Harrisburg drinking cocoa, while her father sat across from her with reports spread out around him, and the 7-year-old had asked her father why he had to write so many reports about the same bridge. And her father had said, because the bridge will fall down if I do not. And the 7-year-old had said, why do you not just say that the first time? And her father had laughed and said, because the people I am writing to do not want the bridge to fall down either, but they have to be reminded. She thought about how her father had written the report 9 times. She thought about how the bridge had fallen down anyway. She thought about how she had spent her whole life believing that her father had failed because the bridge had fallen down, and how she had only understood sometime in the last 4 years in this depot on this platform that her father had not failed at all. The bridge had fallen down because the people he had been writing to had failed. Her father had done his work. Her father had kept his end of the contract, which was to write the report every time, even when he knew nobody would read it, even when he knew that doing it would cost him more than they would ever pay him for it. The men who failed are the men who do not write the reports. The men who succeed are the men who write them even into silence, even into refusal, even into the certainty that nothing they write will be acted upon. The work is the work. The reports get written. That is the only contract that matters in the end. Her father had succeeded. He had succeeded all the way to the end. The chronometer ticked at her collarbone. The coffee was ready. The fire was warm. The first car of the morning was already coming up the access road headlights, visible through the trees. Somebody who had read about the depot in a guidebook and had driven from somewhere far away to see it. Adelaide picked up the coffee pot. She poured a fresh mug and set it on the high desk where Hollis Pierce had once set them every morning for 26 years, for crews that were not his responsibility. The car pulled up to the platform. A man got out. He was perhaps 70. He wore a denim jacket. He looked at the depot for a long moment before he walked toward the door. Adelaide opened the door for him. "Good morning," she said. "Come in, the coffee is ready." The man stepped inside. Behind him, the sun came up over the eastern ridgeline of the Allegheny foothills, and the light fell across the platform of the Hartwell Junction Depot, and the chronometers ticked in the ticket office, keeping perfect railroad time, the way they had been keeping perfect railroad time for 90 years, and the way they would keep it with patient fidelity for whoever came next.